We're nearly at the end of our deep weekend, and it's been a rewarding weekend. We're so glad that all of you have been a part of it. Our last speaker for the weekend is Andrew Phillips. Andrew, I think we were talking, we figured out this is the third time Andrew has been here to help us out at Asheville Road. It's been too long since we've had him back, so I'm glad that he is here this morning. Andrew's been preaching for the Graymere congregation in Columbia, Tennessee for 13 years. He also teaches classes for Heritage Christian University, and he's a very capable communicator of God's Word, as you will soon see. He's going to finish off our discussion of the great miracle of Christ, the feeding of the 5,000. As he talks to us about a final question we're discussing as we think about less is more this weekend. And the question is, what will God do with what I bring? I'll turn it over to Andrew.
I'm thankful to get to be with you today and grateful for the opportunity. I have to tell you that I have already been encouraged and really impressed with what's taken place this weekend. I know things like this don't happen without a lot of hard work, and so I know there's been an army of volunteers that have made this possible. I know with Eli and Drew and all those who have been working to make this a reality. I've always appreciated people who pour time and effort into the lives of teenagers and the lives of our young people, and then becoming a parent and having teenagers of my own, that appreciation has only deepened and grown. It's also been a really neat opportunity to get to connect with a lot of people that I know from different aspects of life, and if I started listing the friends I've gotten to catch up with last night and today, I'd probably leave someone out. I don't want to do that, but I do just want to say thank you, and especially to those of you who are teens who have been here all weekend, and you've set aside time. I know your schedules are busy. I know there's a lot you could have been doing, and it says a lot about you, and it says a lot about your focus that you're willing to set aside this time to think about spiritual things and to focus on how to grow. So I really appreciate that. It is a blessing to be here. I was thinking as we read through the feeding of the 5,000, preparing for today, I was thinking about what moments like this were like in the life of Jesus' apostles. Our family, a few months ago, was able to go on just kind of a quick family vacation during the summer, and there were some places that we wanted to visit. And one of those is a place in Pelham, Tennessee called the Caverns. If you've never been there before, it's one of those cave tours you can get where they go through and they'll take you into the cave and they'll turn the lights off and everything is just totally dark. And it's a really neat tour, and so we were excited about that. I'd never been there before, so I did what I normally do if I'm going to a new place, which is I put the address and the GPS on my phone and just followed the directions. And so we pulled off the interstate and we pulled down a country road, and we were turning in what looked like a small country road, and I saw a car coming out, turning around, which probably should have been our first clue. But as we followed the GPS and as we turned down this road, we saw a sign. This sign wasn't there to advertise anything. It wasn't there for a business. It was a sign that was simply telling us, dead end, and right under it, your GPS is wrong, which I like on a couple of different levels. Number one, the fact that whoever lives down this road has had enough people turn down the road that they've had to say dead end, but then they knew exactly what I thought when I read dead end, which is, well, wait a minute, my GPS says this is the right way to go. And I wonder how many conversations this person has had. So they finally just said, your GPS is wrong. I know what you're thinking, but your GPS is not accurate. And so we turned around. We did eventually find it. And you can tell someone knows you really well when, as I was turning around, Catherine, my wife, was in the passenger seat, and she says, do you want me to take a picture of this for a sermon illustration? And I said, I think I do. I think this would be great. So I've been able to use this. But there is something about that has reminded me of just how reliant we've become on these kinds of things, right? How reliant I've become on something that didn't even exist when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we had a handy map that was in the glove box of every vehicle we had. Growing up in Memphis, it was a spiral-bound map, and it had a grid, and you had to find out where something was on the index and map it out, and how are you going to get across there, and it was complicated. Now we're so used to something that I can't even fully explain to you. I can't tell you exactly how it works. I can't describe to you how the GPS knows where I am or how to get me where I need to go. But I've come to rely on it. We rely on things that we don't even fully understand. But we reach moments like this where the best resources I have available, exactly what I have that's supposed to help me navigate through life, is wrong. And there were a lot of moments that Jesus and his apostles ran into where the apostles had figured out exactly what needed to happen. We just read from John's account of the feeding of the 5,000, which is familiar territory to everybody who's been here this weekend, because that's been the theme of the weekend, but maybe it's a good reminder for those of us who haven't been here all weekend. It's the only miracle that we see. I mean, we see it in all 4 Gospels. It's powerful. And it's a miracle that reminds us of Jesus' care for people. Mark's account says that he saw them and had compassion on them like sheep without a shepherd. John tells us that after this took place, they decided that they wanted to try to make him king by force. They already knew Jesus could heal people. And now that he can provide in the middle of a desert for thousands, that sounds like someone you might want to lead you into battle against your oppressors. People came away from this with a lot of different ideas. But in that conversation that we just read that Jesus has with Andrew and then with Philip, you can see that they've already calculated what needed to happen. They've put it in their GPS. They know what needs to happen. Andrew says, this is not going to be enough. What is this for so many people? Philip's already done the math, right? He knows exactly how much money it would take to provide a meal for all of these people here. And they had to have one of these moments where they realized maybe their GPS was wrong. Maybe the thing that they had been relying on was wrong. And so as we reflect on what it would be like to be around the Sea of Galilee, this is a picture I took last year when we were part of a group that was privileged to go on a tour there. That setting, as Jesus is taking something that would not have been very much, and you may have already been reminded this weekend that the loaves and the fish would not necessarily have been what I always pictured growing up. I pictured a full-size fish that someone would be proud of catching after they had been in a fishing tournament, and it gets the prize. It's not a fish that's very big. In fact, it might be closer to like a sardine or a garnish or just something very, very little. And yet, when it's brought to Jesus, the question is, what is he going to do with it? What will God do with what I bring him? It seems to me we can make a couple of different mistakes when we think about what we have to offer. And we were reminded last night in a powerful way that it's not about us. We could come to God the way the rich young ruler came to Jesus. And he said, here are all the things I've been keeping since I was a child. Here's a list of my accomplishments. Here's my resume. Here's my net worth. Here's what I have. And look at all that I have to offer. One of the songs I can remember singing growing up had a few lines in it that said, I work so hard for Jesus, I often boast and say, I've sacrificed a lot of things to live the narrow way. I gave up fame and fortune. And in this line, I'm worth a lot to thee. That seems to me like that could be one extreme, where I come to Jesus and I say, boy, look at what my history has been. Do you know how long I've been a Christian? Do you know how many years my family has been Christian? Do you know how many generations, how many different ways that we've been involved and we've blessed the church? I'm worth a lot to thee. But then the other extreme would be what we see in the words of Andrew, what is this? How could this even help? Sometimes we feel that way about what we have to offer. We look at everything in our lives, the things that we wish would be different and the things we wish we'd done differently, and we bring those to God. And I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with people, and these are the kinds of conversations you have sometimes when people find out you're a minister or you invite them to worship with you. They might say something like, well, if you just knew what I'd done, if you just knew where I'd been, then you would know you don't want me to have any part of this church. Or the ceiling would fall in on me if I walked in there. Sometimes we have that idea. And so a healthier way for us to approach this question, what would God do with it, to reflect on what God does through these loaves and fish in Jesus' miracle, is to think about Paul's attitude when he's writing to the church in Corinth. If you'd like to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we're sort of supplementing our understanding of what God does in this miracle with our understanding of our role as servants of His. This is the way Paul addresses this issue. And when he's writing to Christians in Corinth, he's writing in a time and a place where status would have been very important. In the first century world of Corinth, people like Apollos, who we know from the book of Acts was a powerful orator and was very eloquent and knew the old law, the Old Testament well, they would have often associated wisdom with the ability to speak like that. And so Apollos would have been very impressive. Paul seems to indicate elsewhere in his writings that he had some enemies that didn't consider him impressive in person, and yet Paul had quite a resume as well. Paul had quite a list of accomplishments. Later on in Scripture, when we read about Paul's describing all the things that he has done and the ways in which he'd served, he was someone who not only had a background of education where he grew up, but also had been trained at the feet of Gamaliel. He and Apollos had a lot going for them. They had long resumes. But here's the way he describes their work as servants of God. He says in verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So that neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Paul begins this letter to Christians in Corinth by addressing some division that had taken place. There were some who were evidently following people who were saying, well, I'm of Peter, I'm of Apollos. This is my guy, this is the one who I've listened to preach, he's the one who converted me. And Paul says that kind of division isn't what our faith in Christ is about. The saddest part of that is they were considering, I follow Peter, I follow Apollos, and some saying, I follow Christ, as if somehow Christ was on the same level. And so he's reminding them here, when we serve, God's the one who causes the growth. He and Apollos weren't divided. They weren't going against each other. They were working together. We've got Christians here in this room representing several different congregations that are working together. We're fellow servants. And so God causes the increase. Now, if I'm thinking about how Jesus could take some loaves and fish and feed thousands, and I'm thinking about how God could take the work of Paul and of Apollos and use it to impact the lives of people in Corinth and even our lives today, there are a couple of principles that I think this morning we can reflect on, hopefully that can encourage us and could inspire us to grow. Asking this question, what will God do with what we have, what I bring to Him? I think the first thing we notice is that our limitations don't limit God. When I'm planting and watering, I realize what my limitations are. I realize what my weaknesses are, things that I wish I did better, abilities that I wish I had. I'm a lot like Phillips sometimes. I've done the math, right? I know where the deficit is. I know what's needed, and there are a lot of ways where we might feel like we don't measure up. And this is true, by the way, at any phase in life. This isn't just something that would affect those of you who are teens, who are in school, who are in that kind of time period where you're seeing, okay, what is it that I like? What is it that I enjoy? What do I want to do? This is something throughout all our lives. We tend to fixate on our own limitations. We think about what's negative. And this is a pattern that we see throughout Scripture, that when God asks people, when He calls people to serve Him, it's really easy to think about our own limitations. And so, for example, we might consider Moses when he encounters a bush in the desert that's burning but isn't burned up. And all of a sudden now he's getting a message from God, and God is giving him a task. Moses has a lot of excuses, but his first excuse is, who am I? His first excuse is thinking of his limitations. Who am I? Why would you choose me to do this? And God's response is, certainly I will be with you. And God continues to respond to Moses' continued excuses. Moses already had tried to do things his own way. He tried to follow his own GPS. He thought it was time for him to be a leader, but that resulted in him taking the life of an Egyptian taskmaster and having to flee the country. And so now God comes to him and he says, wait a minute, who am I? Or maybe we reflect on God calling Gideon, that they were going to defeat the Midianites, and Gideon was going to be the one who would lead them. Now, Gideon was not a soldier at this point. In fact, he responds by telling God, I am of the least of my clan, the least of my family. All he could see was his own limitations. And God's response was, but I will be with you. Now, like Moses, Gideon takes more convincing. There's more that happens before Gideon is leads people into battle. And even when he leads people into battle, he doesn't do it with a huge army. God wants to be clear who's giving this victory. And so he says, but I will be with you. We might even reflect on Jeremiah starting his vocation as a prophet. And there's really vivid object lessons that we see with a boiling pot there in Jeremiah chapter 1. And here's the message. And Jeremiah is going to have to deliver messages that aren't going to be pleasant. And he's not sure about it because of how young he is. He's thinking about his limitations. And yet the response from God is, I am with you to deliver you. Now, I bring all these up just to remind us that when God calls us to serve and we think about our limitations, notice the consistency in God's response. God doesn't respond the way we might be tempted to respond to someone who says, well, I just don't know. I don't know if I can do it. God doesn't say, oh, well, you have all of the talents and abilities. He doesn't tell Moses, you'll be able to convince Pharaoh. He doesn't tell Gideon, you're a powerful enough soldier that you can do all of this. He says, I am going to be with you. Moses is thinking, who am I to lead the people out of Israel? And God is saying, well, out of Egypt, I'll be leading the people out of Egypt. He'll be doing it through Moses. Gideon says, who am I to lead the people against Midian? And God says, no, I'll give you victory. I am with you. Jeremiah is thinking, how am I old enough to be able to accomplish this? And God says, I'm the one who's accomplishing it. I'm doing it through you. Our limitations don't limit him. I think that's encouraging, because in a time where it's so easy for us to focus on the negative and what's limiting, we serve a God who will take our abilities and use them anyway. I have a friend who likes to say, sometimes God uses us in spite of us. Just think about that for a second. That's something we can really chew on. Sometimes God uses us in spite of us. There are times that I might really be trying to serve, and even in spite of all my mistakes and flaws, God still can use those efforts. He can take what we have and He can make it more powerful. When I think about that concept, I'm reminded of one of those movies that seems to have stuck around for a long time. It was around when I was a child, when I was younger, it was around when my children were growing up. Maybe you've seen The Lion King in one of its forms. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to try not to spoil it for you. I don't want to tell you what happens in The Lion King. I'm just going to tell you there's one scene where there's the young lion cub, Simba, who's already excited about his future. He's sung about being a king and what it's going to be like. But he and his friend Nala get off track. They get off course. And all of a sudden they end up where they shouldn't be, and there's a pack of wild hyenas that are around them, about to attack. And Simba tries to do what lions do. He tries to roar, but he's a lion cub, so his roar doesn't sound very intimidating. And then there's a moment as they're all laughing where he tries it again. And when you have that roar that we already know is not going to be coming from him, you have this giant roar from his father. You have Mufasa's roar. He has shown up. And so there's something about that picture of the lion cub trying desperately to do something that's intimidating, but then all of a sudden what they hear is powerful. I think that's a good picture for how we are called to serve, and we give what seems to us like something very limited, but God takes it and does incredible things with it. I was reminded of this feeling a few years ago when I was on a mission trip in India. And if you've ever been to another country and you've worked with translators, you know there are a lot of challenges there. And I had this moment that I have most any time I'm in another country, when you stand up to speak and you're using an interpreter and you're looking at people who are coming from such different backgrounds and different cultures, and you're thinking to yourself, how is what I've prepared going to impact them? What use is this going to be for them? Our lives are so different, and how am I going to be able to speak to any needs that are there? And I can remember thinking that, sort of feeling self-conscious, and then looking over to my right, where the translator was someone I'd gotten to know. He's one of the preachers in that area. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that he knows their culture and he knows English. And when I watched how expressive he was in his translating, I started thinking, I think he is taking this message and he's taking it and making it effective to them, helping them understand in their culture, explaining things that I might have said that didn't make much sense or that showed a lack of cultural understanding. I was focused only on my limits, but I was standing next to someone who was removing those limits and seeking to communicate God's word with people. What do you have this morning that God can use? God can use our talents. That may be the first thing that comes to mind, what we're good at. But God can also use things that we're not as fond of thinking about. Is there something in your past, maybe something that was painful and that was hurtful, but God could use that through you to minister to and encourage others? Do you think there's someone else who's going through what you went through that you could walk beside, that you could put your arms around? Even the things that are difficult for us to remember and to dwell on, those limitations, they don't limit God. God can work through us. And the reason he can work through us is because just like he's not limited by our limitations, he's also not limited by our abilities. I think one of the important messages to reflect on in 1 Corinthians 3 is something that is said more than once. God causes the growth. The growth didn't come from Paul's abilities or the eloquent speaking of Apollos. That was used to spread the word. God was using that. But when there was growth, it came from God. We're called to serve, but our power doesn't come from us. It comes from the one that we serve. We're all qualified to be servants, but God is the master. And that means that God also should get the credit. And I think sometimes, even in our language, it kind of betrays our tendency to forget that. When we talk, for example, about someone who becomes a child of God, and someone might be tempted to say, well, I converted this person. Well, I understand what we mean by that, but isn't it good to be reminded that God is the one who caused that growth in that person's life? God, working through His people and through His Word, is what convicted that person. And we might think of a ministry we're a part of, and it might be tempting to say, well, when I started this ministry, we only had this many people, or we were only affecting this many lives, but now look at how much it's grown. Well, that's good, but God's the one who causes that growth. We need to be reminded of that. One of the reasons I think the feeding of the 5,000 is such a powerful, vivid illustration of God's power is because it is so obvious that only Jesus could take what was given and feed everyone else. There's no way you could mistake that the work of the apostles made that happen. It's a powerful reminder for us. God, through His people and through His Word, He's choosing to work. God builds us up, God builds congregations up, and God gets the credit. The people who plant and water, we serve. And you can go to bookstores and online and you can order a lot of books on church growth. And I've read a lot of those books and benefited from them. And you could listen online to seminars as people talk about church growth, and I've benefited from those things. But the longer I'm in ministry, the more I'm convicted that we can serve, we can plant, and we can water, but God is the one who causes the growth. When there's growth that takes place, it's evidence of God's work. And that's encouraging to me because that means I can focus on the things I can do, the things that I can control. It seems to me like this kind of growth has a lot to do with farming, with that planting and watering imagery. If you've been involved in farming, I have friends that are, and one of the things you know is that if you're in farming, you're working hard and you're working diligently, but when it comes to crops growing, there's a lot you can do to create the right environment for growth. There's a lot you can do to remove barriers or obstacles to growth. But when a seed grows, it's a reminder of God's work. Our responsibility is planting and watering. I think it's also encouraging because that means the results of our planting and watering aren't always immediate. Sometimes it can be really discouraging if I think after sitting down and having one conversation or maybe one Bible study with someone that I'm not seeing any growth. Maybe it could be weeks or months and I'm not seeing anything. It's good to be reminded I'm just called to plant and to water. God will handle the results. In fact, if you read through the book of Acts, there were different results in different places. In Acts chapter 2, when Peter stands up and he preaches and thousands of people become Christians, we don't read about Peter saying, well, for my first sermon, this was pretty good. We've got thousands of responses. I must be pretty good at preaching. And then a few chapters later, when Paul's in Mars Hill, only a few people believe. Well, we don't read Paul looking at that saying, I must not be very good at this. It just means that we're planting and watering, and sometimes we're going to have a certain kind of growth, and sometimes we'll have others. Our responsibility is planting and watering, allowing God to use us. So He's not limited by our limitations. He's also not limited by our abilities. He can do far more than we can imagine. Maybe something we could do this morning is to try to dream in our own lives. What is it that I could dream? What's a goal that I could have, a dream that I could have that is so big it would be clear that if this happens, it's because God was working through me, because God was working through His people. What could that be in your life? When you take the abilities that you've been given and ask the question, what will God do with it? What is it that you could dream of this morning? Got a lot of youth groups here. Maybe there's some goals as a youth group you have, as a youth ministry that you say, I want this to be a reality when we get back to Bible class together. I want this to be the way our youth group culture is. Maybe it's something personal, something in your life that needs to be different, and you say, I want this to change. We're all going to have moments like this where we get to a point and we realize my best thinking is not getting me where I need to go. And if I take my best thinking and I give it to God, it's encouraging to ask ourselves what God will do with it. In his book, Practicing Resurrection, Eugene Peterson tells a story about Fred and Cheryl. Fred and Cheryl in 1985 went to Haiti to pick up a 5-year-old girl named Addie that they were adopting. Addie had lost her parents in a car accident, and so they adopted her, and they took her home. Addie got to meet her 2 new older brothers. They were teenage boys. Now, Addie had had a challenging life in Haiti, and as they sat around the table for their first family dinner, there was more food on that table than she had probably seen in one place before. And as she was looking at that, she saw her 2 teenage brothers do what teenage boys tend to do, which is they started eating and eating and eating. And when they were done with what was on their plate, they got seconds, and they kept going. And all of a sudden, Addie got very quiet and wasn't sure how to handle all of this. So Cheryl got up from the table and took her to the kitchen. And she had suspected, rightly as it turns out, that Addie was taken aback because when you had a lot of food, sometimes that meant you wouldn't have food for the next several meals or even days. And so she was really kind of shocked by how quickly all this was getting eaten. And so Cheryl took her to the kitchen, and she showed her the bread that was there in the pantry. She showed her the milk and the juice and the vegetables and eggs that were in the fridge. She showed her the potatoes and onions and canned goods. She opened the freezer to show her some things she had frozen, and she kept repeating that they had enough. Her new daughter needed to hear this message. We have enough. It's so easy to focus on what's negative about ourselves, what's negative in our lives, to think, I don't really have anything God could use. But when we're reminded of His power, we're reminded that He has enough. It's more than enough. Not only to sustain us, but even for us to have the privilege to be used by God. It's also powerful to reflect on Jesus feeding the 5,000, providing for them. In a sense, Moses had led the people of Israel. They'd had manna in the desert. Now Jesus is here giving them bread. And John will go on to say Jesus would describe Himself as the bread of life. That as powerful as this physical miracle was, there was something spiritual Jesus had in mind. And it's that message that's still open to us today. And so we're going to have an opportunity, if you need to decide to turn your life around, to give it over to God, ask that question, what will God do with it? It's exciting to imagine what would happen. It may be that you're ready to make that decision to turn your life over to Christ, to put Him on in baptism and begin living for Him. I can tell you this is a wonderful time to make that choice, and you've got a room full of people who would love to encourage you. It could be that maybe you've hit one of those dead ends. You feel like your GPS has led you in a direction that you shouldn't have gone, and you want to make things right. You want to turn your life around. I can tell you, if you're a guest here, you are among people that love you and that care for you and that would love to encourage you. Let's determine to give God everything we are and see how He uses us. If there's any way we can help you, please come as we stand, as we all sing together.